Welcome back, everyone. So we're finally doing it, diving into this whole world of indigenous knowledge. And I got to say, when we first talked about this, I was kind of picturing, like lush forest, maybe some cool weeding techniques. But then you mentioned focusing on how different indigenous groups adapted to like totally different climates, and that kind of blew my mind a little.
It's pretty amazing, right, how the environment really pushes human ingenuity in all sorts of directions. And it shows just how deep and how wide indigenous knowledge really is. It's not just, one set of practices. It's like this whole way of looking at the world and living in it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So where do we even begin with something this big?
Well, our source material breaks things down into 5 main climate zones, polar and subpolar, then temperate, tropical and subtropical, arid and semi-arid, and finally, mountainous regions.
5 climate zones. That's a lot to cover. But okay, let's jump right in. And why don't we start with the one that's the furthest from those lush forests I was thinking about? Polar and subpolar. Like, just thinking about it, how do people even survive, let alone thrive, in a place that's basically winter all the time?
Resourcefulness. That's the key. Every single part of life in those regions means you got to really understand the environment and be able to squeeze every last drop of use out of what you've got. Like, think about the igloo.
Oh, yeah. Igloos, people always say they're surprisingly warm inside.
Yeah.
I never really got how that works, It's made of snow, right?
Right. But it's not just any snow. It's like super densely packed, carefully chosen so it works as insulation. Plus that dome shape. It actually minimizes surface area so less heat gets lost. They even build a raised sleeping platform because the warm air rises.
Huh. So there's like a whole science to it. It's not just like piling up snow. It's amazing how every little detail has a purpose. Speaking of making the most of what you got, the source material talks about these fat lamps called quollic.
Oh yeah, fueled by seal or whale blubber. They weren't just for warmth, they were a social thing too, like a gathering place. Makes you think, about what we consider advanced tech these days.
Totally. It challenges the whole idea that, sustainability is this new thing.
Yeah.
These communities were living sustainably way before we even had a word for it.
Exactly. It's not about, romanticizing the past or anything, but there's a ton of wisdom we can learn from how they did things.
Okay, so shelter and warmth, check.
Yeah.
But food? I can't imagine growing much of anything with permafrost everywhere.
It's definitely a challenge. But they developed some pretty clever techniques like raised beds and tussocks, basically mounds of soil that are insulated from the frozen ground underneath.
So you're creating little pockets of warmth for the plants. I'm guessing the growing season's super short though, huh?
Extremely short. You got to make every day count. Communities have to be really smart about timing and resources. Speaking of which, how do you think they kept food from going bad without refrigerators?
Good question. It's not exactly warm enough to dry or smoke food like they do in other places.
Remember that permafrost we were talking about? Not just a challenge for gardening, it's also a solution. They dug ice cellars right into the permafrost to store food and fresh water, kept everything frozen year-round.
A natural freezer.
Yeah.
Never would have thought of that. Really shows how adaptable people can be. Okay, so the polar and subpolar regions, people not only survive, but they actually thrive in one of the toughest environments on the planet. I'm starting to see why you wanted to focus on this. Where to next on our climate zone tour?
Let's head south, to the temperate regions. Think forests, fertile land, and a whole lot of human ingenuity figuring out fire, water, all of that.
Lead the way. I'm already hooked.
Back again for more on indigenous knowledge. It's amazing, right, how these practices, ones that have been developed for centuries, they actually have some answers for those big sustainability questions we're dealing with now.
It's like they had this front row seat to how nature really works, like that delicate balance, and they learn to work with it, not against it. So, from the frozen north, what's up next in the temperate regions?
It's all about balance there. Not as extreme as the poles, obviously, but you've got those distinct seasons and all kinds of different ecosystems. And that's led to a lot of different ways of adapting, especially when it comes to how people managed resources like forests and water.
Right. Makes sense. Actually, I remember reading in our sources about cultural burning practices, especially with indigenous groups in California. I gotta say, the idea of setting fires on purpose always seemed, a little backwards to me.
Yeah, I get that, especially with all the news about these huge wildfires, right? But these controlled burns they did, usually when it was cooler, they were a huge part of how they took care of the land for, thousands of years.
So it's more like hitting the reset button for the whole ecosystem.
Right.
But in a good way.
Exactly. By getting rid of all that underbrush, it actually stops those bigger, out of control fires from happening. Plus, it clears the way for new plants, puts nutrients back in the soil, even helps some seeds sprout. Totally different from just putting out every fire like we do a lot nowadays.
Wow, that's crazy. It's like, what, preventative medicine for the whole forest. And talking about systems that are carefully put together, our sources mentioned the Three Sisters Garden too. Remember learning about that in school. But looking at it from this indigenous knowledge perspective, it feels like, I don't know, more than just planting stuff together.
It's about understanding how nature works and using that to your advantage. So, planting maize, beans, and squash all together isn't just to save space, you're creating this whole relationship between them. The maize gives the beans something to climb on, the beans put nitrogen back into the soil, and the squash keeps the ground moist and stops weeds from growing.
Whoa, it's like each plant has its own job to do, and it all helps the whole system. Our modern farms, where they just plant one thing over and over, it seems kind of basic now, huh?
It shows a difference between thinking of land as something you just use up and seeing it as something that's alive that you got to take care of. That respect for nature, for how everything's connected, it's a big part of indigenous knowledge.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's not just about techniques, it's like this whole philosophy.
Yeah.
Which reminds me, our sources talked about the Chaga people on Mount Kilimanjaro too. They have these awesome forest gardens that you can barely tell apart from the natural forest around them.
Those gardens show just how well they know their local environment. They picked and arranged all these different species so carefully. They made this layered canopy that gives them food, medicine, even building materials. And it helps control the water flow too.
So they're not just copying nature, they're becoming a part of it. That's pretty mind-blowing. But what about water in these regions? We talked about ice cellars in the Arctic, but I guess it's a whole other challenge in temperate climates, right?
For sure. It's less about keeping water from freezing and more about making sure you've got enough all year round, especially when things get dry. Our sources talk about the Tlawaquiat First Nations in Vancouver Island. They use these giant cedar tanks and natural reservoirs to collect rainwater.
Cedar janks. Wow. Must have taken some serious skills like woodworking and engineering to build something that big that can hold all that water.
Yeah, it shows how creative and forward-thinking they were. And halfway across the world, the Maori in New Zealand, they're really into restoring wetlands. And they're using their traditional knowledge to figure out which native plants are the best for cleaning the water.
So it's not just about managing what's already there. It's about making things better, bringing them back to life. That's awesome. Makes you think maybe we could learn something from that for our own water problems these days.
Definitely makes you wonder how we could use some of those ideas, those ways of thinking, to create water systems that are better for the future, more sustainable and resilient.
Okay, from the freezing Arctic to the forests and wetlands of those temperate regions, we've seen some seriously incredible stuff. Where are we heading to next on this climate journey?
Get ready because we're about to enter the world of tropical and subtropical regions. Think lush, think vibrant, think pure abundance of life. And get ready to be amazed by how indigenous communities have thrived there.
All right, let's go. I'm ready for some tropical vibes. From the Arctic, all ice and snow, to those temperate zones with their forests and wetlands. And now we're hitting the tropical and subtropical regions. It's like we're going from survival mode straight into abundance mode.
Yeah, you got it. These places, they're bursting with life, so much diversity, and the growing season never really ends. It's amazing to see how indigenous folks have figured out how to use all that abundance, But still, they have this deep respect for the balance, for how delicate everything is.
So instead of battling the elements, it's more like working with this huge web of life.
Exactly. Think of it like a symphony, right? All these different parts playing together. And indigenous knowledge in these regions, it's all about understanding that music and playing along with it.
Okay, I'm getting this picture in my head. Lush rainforests, all those crazy colors.
Yeah.
But what's that actually look like? Our sources mentioned something about agrobiodiversity and polyculture.
Picture a garden that's more like a mini rainforest, not like rows of the same plant over and over. So you've got tons of different species all growing together, all jumbled up. That's polyculture, and it's a big deal for indigenous agriculture in these places.
Oh, right, like the chagras, right? Those gardens that Amazonian indigenous people have. I was reading about those. They grow like everything there. Cassava, maize, fruit trees, even medicinal plants.
Yeah.
All in one spot.
And it's not just for the variety. Each plant has a purpose, like a job to do. They make the soil better, bring in good bugs, keep the bad bugs away, even create their own little climate that helps everything grow. Totally different from those giant fields of just one crop that you see everywhere else.
It's like they've created this whole ecosystem in one garden that takes care of itself. Which reminds me, our sources talked about trees too, like how important they are in these areas, especially this thing called agroforestry.
Oh, yeah, agroforestry. Think about the Maya people in Central America. They've been doing a type of agroforestry called forest gardening for like forever. It's about putting trees into the farm, creating layers, just like a real forest.
So you're not cutting down trees to plant food, you're working with the trees that are already there. That just seems so much smarter.
It is. And it's not just about the food either. These systems help with water, keep the soil from washing away, and give all kinds of animals and plants a place to live. More biodiversity. It's all about seeing the bigger picture, how it's all connected.
It's making me think about another example, the home gardens in Kerala, India. The way they were described, it sounds like this beautiful mix of garden and forest. Like you can barely tell where one ends and the other begins.
They're incredible. It shows how creative and in tune with nature people can be. Every little space is used, from the top of the trees all the way down to the ground, and each plant is there for a reason.
Okay, so food, forests, all good. But what about water? With all that rain they get, I bet it's less about finding water and more about, I don't know, managing all that water, right?
Yeah, you got it. Too much rain can be just as bad as not enough if you don't handle it right. Our sources talk about this system in Bali called the subak. It's all about sharing the water for those rice paddies they have there, making sure everyone gets their fair share. But they also make sure the whole water system stays healthy, like the rivers and streams and stuff.
So it's not just about moving the water around, it's about understanding the whole water system and how it all fits together.
Exactly. And it shows how important it is for people to work together and to respect the way water naturally flows.
Wow. Okay, so from the Arctic to the tropics, so many different ways of doing things, but they all have this one thing in common, understanding nature deeply.
It's a really important reminder, Indigenous knowledge, it's not just about the techniques, it's a whole different way of looking at the world, how we connect to the land, to the resources. And it's about living sustainably and being resilient, being able to bounce back from tough times.
This whole deep dive, it's been inspiring, but I'm also kind of thinking, okay, what now? How can we take these lessons from Indigenous communities and actually use them in our own lives? Like for sustainability and stuff.
That's the big question, right? It's not about copying exactly what they do, but about changing how we think, being more aware of how we're connected to nature, respecting traditional knowledge, and being open to learning from people who've been living sustainably for, forever.
You've given us a lot to think about. Thanks for taking us on this journey.
But the journey's not over, right? The real work starts now when we take what we've learned and use it to make the world a better, more sustainable place. So keep exploring, keep learning, and keep that spirit of Indigenous knowledge alive in your own life.